that was the favorite painting of the British people,
Exactly.
or some such thing?
Yes. And he wanted to know why this was. So I did some research on this, and it was really fun. It was really interesting to learn more, because I mean, I knew the painting and I knew it was Turner, and you know, the fact that it's beloved of the British wasn't that surprising. But it's a really good example to talk about in terms of the idea of what people like and how preferences change. And you know, we talked a bit about it with the Mona Lisa, that, you know, why do people have this idea that this is like the greatest painting ever made? And the reasons have little to do with the work of art. And this is somewhat the same case. This is British. The story, the Fighting Temeraire, it's this ship that's being towed to the junkyard. Really, it's going to be decommissioned and taken apart for scrap, and it was the last remaining ship that fought in the Battle of Trafalgar. It's not the ship that Nelson was on, Admiral Lord Nelson. It's not his ship, but it is the last ship. So to the British, this is an extremely important moment. It's very patriotic, it's very political. They consider the Battle of Trafalgar like one of the greatest moments in British history, where this sort of coalition of navies defeated the combined navies of Napoleon and the Spanish navies together off Trafalgar, which is just off the coast of Gibraltar. So it is a key moment. To us, it's like, I don't know, the famous painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware. You know, I mean, it's not that that's a famous, you know, the painting is famous, but not because it's a particularly great work of art. This is a great work of art. It's a really good example of a Turner. And I've already decided, you know, next time I teach anything to do with this topic, I'm substituting the one I showed you for this one. I'm going to show this one because it is a great Turner and a great romantic painting. But, you know, its reasons for it being the greatest painting have more to do with sort of patriotism and British history.
But, you know, Peggy, we have a literary parallel to that in the U.S., which is the poem by Oliver Wendell Holmes about Old Ironsides. And it's the same situation. It's an old, out-of-date fighting ship. I think it was from the Revolution, and it's being decommissioned and taken apart. And the poet is talking about, you know, what that means, you know, what that signifies to the nation.
Yeah. They're both they're seen as a kind of end of a heroic era in a way. It's a heroic sensibility to it too.
It's an elegy, kind of.
Exactly. It's sort of a nostalgia for your heroic past. Yeah.
Could, by 1838, could they make prints of that famous painting and popularize it? Or
yes,
were there knockoffs floating around in the public so it popularized it?
Honestly, I don't know if there were, but there absolutely could have been, because even by they certainly could have done etchings and engravings of this painting. They wouldn't have been in color yet. They could have even done early lithographs, because lithography techniques were beginning in the 1820s. But I honestly don't know if they did. I wouldn't be surprised at all if there were. Another reason this is famous is Turner, you know, I mentioned he was a pretty wise person. He's that working class guy. He knew how to sell himself. Turner, in his will, left a lot of works to the British people, but he demanded that they be hung in the National Gallery in a certain place. He like controlled his future. He's one of the few who did this to make sure that he would be known forever. So this is in the National Gallery in London, and it's in a very prominent place because they had no choice but to put it there if they were going to get it. So you know, I just thought that was pretty smart. I don't know too many other artists who've tried to control, you know, how their art was seen long after their deaths. But Turner did, and it worked with this one.
So Peggy, I was listening to a course on tape the other day about American expatriates who went to Paris. And one of the groups of them were artists. And of course, they went to study but there was also like a cottage industry, and I think they said this was true in London too, that if you were an American art student, one of the things you would do is go to the museums and copy
Yeah.
the famous works and then bring them back to America with you. And this was how you could support, you know, your being in Europe to study art there. So it seems like that was probably true in Europe too, that there was a demand for copies by
Absolutely, there
competent.
were. It was just like you say, it's partially a way of learning by studying another person's work and painting it. But there was a huge market, not only in America, but in Europe. In fact, it was considered, you know, quite acceptable to do. Major collectors would send artists out to do copies of this or that. It did become problematic at some points. And it's not like a law, but it's now standard that when you copy a work of art, you never copy the same dimensions as the original. You have to change the dimensions so that there can never be confusion as to what is the original, because that was happening. There are people who could copy something so exact and then claims of, no, mine's the original, yours is the copy. But if you change the dimensions, that's never going to happen. That's sort of drilled into art students, and everybody in the art world knows you never copy the exact dimensions of a work of art. So, yeah.
As I recall, back in the 70s or 60s, the market here was saturated with paintings probably made by students in Europe, right? Anybody remember that? And you could get some really nice oil paintings at very reasonable mass-produced prices. And I always visualize some poor guy sitting there with 14 canvases lined up, because I knew a guy that used to do that. And, and you get this color and go down, then you come back with the next color and just mass produce them. You know?
Yeah, the idea of the starving artist shows, you know, you've all seen those ads. You don't see them anymore, but you used to see ads for those starving artist paintings. Those things were turned out in warehouses in Mexico, and they were done just like you said, like 1, 2, 3. They weren't copies of any specific works of art. They were just images that looked vaguely modern. And they're. We'll talk more about that later, because that's getting into the idea of kitsch, and that's a concept that is for a little bit later idea. But thanks for bringing it up. I'm going to keep that in mind. Okay, let's move on. We just finished Romanticism. So now we're moving at mid-century. You know, the whole first half of the century was dominated by Romanticism. Romanticism was early on, especially in France, resisted by the Academy because it's not French classicism, but eventually Romanticism was accepted and worked its way into the Academy. But this moment right here, this key moment in 1848, is going to change everything. It ends this friendly period, this period that was friendly to the middle class, and this was our revolution. This is our working class socialist revolution. And this brief 4-year period of the Second Republic is going to change everything very dramatically. So this is the moment we are in terms of what I'm going to be talking about now. Because it's right at mid-century that a split happens in the art world. And it's a very important split, a very telling one that has come down to us pretty much to today. And in fact, it's the split between the academics and the avant-garde. Now, prior to this, that wasn't as big a split, because generally, even if something was kind of progressive and a little too modern, it does eventually get accepted. But with the formal split between the academic painters and the avant-garde painters, the avant-garde will never be accepted within the Academy. It's like a line is drawn in the sand, and we will go this far, but not one step further. And that's the movement we're going to talk about. Academic, interestingly, at the beginning of the 19th century, the word academic was a very positive thing. If someone said your work is academic, you know, that was good. You fit it. To be accepted in the academy was a very positive thing. But at the end of the 19th century, if someone tells you your work is academic, that is an insult. They're basically telling you it's formulaic, it looks just like everybody else's, etc. And that shift from the academy being a positive thing to a negative thing is happening during this time. And it's because the more progressive artists, and we'll see what we mean by that, are breaking free from that academic system, which means the quality of art is going down throughout the century. Doesn't mean they're all bad art, but they have a different agenda. They have a different patron in terms of what they're interested in. And also by this time, it's no longer called the Royal Academy. It's simply the Académie des Beaux-Arts, or basically the Academy of Fine Arts, but I'll just call it the French Academy. And the avant-garde, these are artists working outside that tradition. The term avant-garde begins to be applied to artists about this time, about mid-century. It's a word that, it's a term that goes back to the French Revolution, and it's a military term. It referred to soldiers who went out ahead of the others. It literally means the front guard or the foreguard, soldiers that went out to sort of reconnoiter the situation. And the term has certain associations. It is associated with the idea of taking risks, of being out ahead of the others, and others following behind you. And so in the 1830s, it started to be used in a social context. If you were socially progressive, that was considered avant-garde. But it begins to be applied to artists by the 1850s and 1860s. But it carries with it those same connotations of being kind of a risk taker and being out ahead of the others. I know the term is used a lot incorrectly to mean just, oh, that's just weird looking, that's avant-garde. Well, that's not what avant-garde means. It means risk taking. And we only know what's avant-garde with hindsight, because we can't know what is the avant-garde of our own era, because we don't know who is the leading edge. We don't know the direction art's going to go in the future. And so we can't define it until we have the ability to look back and see what really was leading the way forward in art. So, but we do have hindsight. Before we look at the avant-garde, I want to look at what happens in the academy and talk a little bit about, you know, who these academic artists are and who they're painting for. And this is a classic example of an academic painting, this by Cabanal, The Birth of Venus. The academy after mid-century is increasingly catering to a middle-class taste. I like to parallel the art of the academy with the rise of kind of the popular novel. It's very similar idea. You have a new sort of educated middle class, but they're not classically educated. They're not educated the way people were 100 years earlier, where only the aristocrats and a few were educated, but they had a classical education. They had read classical literature, they'd studied Latin, they knew all of the myths and stories. It's a different kind of education. These people are educated, they are wealthy enough to pay for art, but they don't want they don't want the same classical art that people wanted 100 years earlier. It's like in literature, you know, they want things to read, but they don't want to read Shakespeare. So what do? We get popular literature for these new kind of middle class. And that's what this is. This is popular art that has one goal, and that's to satisfy a market, a huge growing market. And so it follows middle class taste. And what they wanted was paintings like this that had some vague reference to classical mythology, because it has the word Venus in the title. It's semi-erotic, but if you disguise it with Venus, it's really not seen so. This really has little or nothing to do with mythology. There's no metaphor or message here. Above all, what they looked for in a painting was a slick surface. Now that may seem superficial, but that's what good painting was in the academy. If you can give me a nice, smooth, slick surface with no brushwork visible, that's a good painting. So that's what they're looking for. And we'll come back to this painting in just a moment, because it's important for other reasons as well. The other thing they wanted was what they had learned from Romanticism, which is a kind of escapism. And Orientalism remains popular, especially in the academy. Now, instead of the sort of painterly exoticism and escapism of the Romantics, it really now is this slick, smooth surface. But painters like Jerome, and I don't mean they're bad painters. Jerome is a wonderful painter. This is really quite beautiful. He went on to become the president of the Academy. But the problem with it is it's not attempting to say anything. It's not about anything. It's really just feeding a market. And many artists were tired of that, and they really wanted to say more and do more, because a lot of things are happening at this point in time. Because I want to talk about realism, because that is what begins in the middle of the century. And realism will continue to be an important aspect of art right up to today. It will never stop. In fact, Romanticism never really stops. All these modernist movements continue in art. They just take different forms. But there are two generations of realism that really use the label realism. The first generation is overtly political, and it's directly influenced by socialism. The first artist we're going to look at was a socialist. There is a call for that. Most importantly, what this rise of socialism did at mid-century was draw people's attentions to the plight of the working class. It was a kind of new awareness. It's not unlike what's happening today, where, people are, so many people are becoming more aware of what life is like, the Black experience, the Black Lives Movement, people who, you can't say they didn't know it, but it's a different level of consciousness that is happening. And that's what was happening at this point. And it happens more when you put it, in people's faces as well, which is what was happening at this time. Certainly Marx and Engels' publication of the Communist Manifesto, but even more so in Paris, there were a number of socialist theorists writing. Proudhon is a very important writer. He was writing even much earlier. He was a close friend of the first artist we're going to look at. And then we'll also look at a second generation. The first generation is overtly political commentary. The second generation is more covert, and they're more interested in social commentary. But it's all realism. It's all looking at my world. That's realism, not escaping to another exotic place, not looking at, classical mythology. It's now. And it increasingly becomes important to do that in art. And in fact, Charles Baudelaire, a very famous poet and art critic and friend of many artists, was one of those writing the most about it. In Painter of Modern Life, he wrote about it in 1863. What is modernity? We began seeing people talk about what is this modern world? How do we define it? What is it about us that's different from the past? And we're going to see different artists defining that. For Baudelaire, what defined modernity is people who responsibly look at their world and question the world they live in. That's what it means to be modern. Old-fashioned art is art that didn't do that either Romanticism or Classicism. They may have been opposites in many ways, but what they had in common is they weren't talking directly about now. Now, they may have been overtly doing so. I mean, when David painted the Oath of the Horatii, he may have on one level been speaking about Paris at that time, but he's still doing it with his ancient language. He's not showing you the world that he lived in. One of the things that Baudelaire talked about was that the idea of the flaneur, that artists should be flaneurs. And we'll talk more about what that means, but that's a way of observing the world, going out and walking around and looking at your world. And I also want to talk about the Second Empire, because that changes how people interact with their world in Paris. The Haussmannization of Paris is a reference to the rebuilding of the city that took place during the Second Empire of Napoleon III. This is when Paris turned into the city we know today, the wide boulevards. You know, before this, Paris was a city with narrow, winding streets. And there are reasons why Napoleon III wanted to rebuild the city. You know, they had had several revolutions, and one of the things that revolutionaries did in Paris was they blockaded the city, and they could do that very easily with these little narrow winding streets. So the Paris we see today, the wide boulevards, they exist so that revolutionaries cannot block the streets and shut the city down. So they're political, but it also meant that city life changed. This is when the Paris we know, with the street cafes and the street lights and basically the nightlife of the city begins. And that's what the flaneur goes out to observe and watches. So people interact differently in the Second Empire than they did before. But let's start with the politics, the first generation. For socialists like Gustave Courbet, realism wasn't an artistic choice, it was a moral imperative.
Diego Rivera, right?
Yeah, same idea, right. He's politically speaking to what is going on in his world. Yeah, people don't stop talking about their era and the politics of their era. That's just the beginning, but it never really ends. But it's basically, and Proudhon, his friend, said it too, you are morally irresponsible if you don't do this. Now, the interesting thing is that Courbet comes along right during this 4-year period of this brief Second Republic, the 4-year period. And if you remember last time, not only did that mean that the French had elected a president who ruled freely for 4 years, but the working class got to vote, bringing a lot of tension on the working class. And there had been a working class revolution in 1848, which is important. But it also meant that for 4 years, the salon at the academy was free, meaning anybody could exhibit there. And he was able to exhibit some of his realist work, which never in a million years would have gotten into an exhibition at the salon. Now let's look at this work, The Stonebreakers. Unfortunately, this painting no longer exists. Many paintings were destroyed in the bombing of World War II. This painting was in a museum in Dresden, and with the bombing of Dresden, it was destroyed along with a great many other works of art. However, there were some high quality photographs taken of the painting in color before it was destroyed. So that's really all we've got to work with. But fortunately, they were really good. So we can at least know what it looks like. Okay, so what do we have? Who are the Stonebreakers? These are also a sign of the new Paris, even though it's not overtly obvious. They're making gravel for the new roads. You know, we still need gravel in building roads. We have huge machines that do all of this, but boy, at the time, people just had to stand there and hit rocks until they turned into gravel. So you see these people everywhere in the city working. He's doing a million intentional things here. One of the things he's doing is using these colors, these very kind of rough, earthy colors. He's showing us the rough textures of the clothing, the wooden clogs that basically working class people wore. The scene itself there's nothing sort of particularly attractive about it. He's also intentionally giving us an older man and a younger boy, suggesting this is an endless cycle, that, you know, once that man was young and this boy's going to grow old doing the same thing, because this is just mindless, backbreaking labor. He's also intentionally not showing us their faces. And he's doing that because he does not want us to identify with them. He doesn't want to romanticize this scene. It would be very easy to romanticize this scene, to make us feel, you know, just give me a rosy sunset back there and this would be an entirely different painting. This would suddenly be romanticized and I could feel better about it somehow. It could be there's some uplifting message. He doesn't want any uplifting message. This is a pure statement of fact. He doesn't want you to see, he doesn't want to ennoble them. He just wants you to see the reality of it. Now, you cannot imagine how controversial this was in the salon. People were outraged. You know, they've been outraged by many movements in art, but nothing like this. This is what people intentionally avoided looking at while they were, you know, riding in their beautiful carriage to the salon exhibition. They would pull down the shades so they didn't have to look at the working class people in the street. And then they get to the exhibition and here they are, you know, 8 foot wide right in front of them. It was an absolute outrage. And not only because of artistic issues, but don't forget, this is a class of people who had a revolution less than a year ago, who tried to overthrow the middle class and set up a socialist revolution. This was politically a hot button issue, very much so. You know, the upper middle class did not want to be reminded of the power of the working class, who still could vote in 1849. So in every way, this is a disturbing painting. Courbet goes on to do many other very disturbing works. After 51, the salon's no longer open and he's no longer going to get to show any work. So he begins holding his own exhibition. He sets a very important precedent. He actually rents a space just down the street from where the salon is running in 1853, and sets up his own. He puts up a big sign, Salon of Realism, he calls it, and puts up all of his paintings, including this one again, but a whole lot of them in the same vein. And this was huge, not because, you know, everybody went to see it, because they did, not everybody went in there, but it was so important as a precedent. Because remember, the one hold the Academy had on artists was this exhibition, was this annual salon. You need to please us if you want people to see your work. But the minute artists figure out how to do an exhibition and set it up so that they don't need the Academy, then quite simply, they don't need the Academy. And that's going to be gradually happening throughout the century. And it begins with Courbet, really. He's beginning this the first, but he's certainly not the last. You know, within 10 years, other exhibition opportunities are going to appear, you know, drawing more and more people away from the Academy and thereby weakening the Academy even more.
So, Peggy, were these guys the equivalent of that period of the starving artists? I mean, who bought their work to put food on the table? Because if middle class didn't like them, who bought their stuff?
There are people who appreciated this work. There wasn't vast amounts of it, so you didn't need vast amounts of patrons. But Courbet had patrons. He had people who understood. There are plenty of socialists in Paris who thought this was the greatest painting ever made. So there are plenty of people who are sympathetic to the socialist cause.
They had the money to be able to buy it then.
Yeah, they did. These were middle-class people. Socialism was quite attractive. It wasn't just working class people who wanted it. There were, you know, all of these writers like Proudhon and other socialists. These are people who had money to afford art. The idea of the starving, that sort of mystique of the starving artist, that is an 1880s thing, and we will look exactly at that generation. But all of the artists before the 1880s, these are basically still gentlemen. These are not bohemians. These are gentlemen. They have supporters, and they're making a living. They're not starving from their art. So I'll let you know when we get to the starving people, because there will be quite literally one who is literally starving. This first generation, no one was as extreme as Courbet. He is one of a kind in the way he embraced the working class. But there are others who were close to what he's doing, who weren't quite as controversial. And one of those people was Millet. This is really a very famous painting. It's certainly well known in America, but it was very famous in general. For various reasons that have more to do with patronage and where it was shown later, etc. But anyway, Millet's The Gleaners, which is also a very important work that speaks of working class at the time, excuse me, but in a slightly different way. The Gleaners of course, were people who were allowed to go out into the field after the harvest and pick up, you know, any little bits of whatever had fallen to the ground. Gleaning had been, for a very long time in France, assumed to be the right of the working class. But new laws were actually being discussed at the time that would make gleaning illegal. And there was a lot of violence in the countryside where gleaners had been attacked. And in fact, this man back here on horseback, he is a constable, and he is out there actually watching over the field to make sure that there's no violence. It's still legal at this point in time. So to keep people from being attacked and beaten for doing this, he's there sort of keeping the peace. It's a little thing that, you know, no one would ever, you know, understand that what was going on or how political this painting was without understanding this is being debated. Now, what makes Millet more acceptable is his work is slightly more romanticized. It's actually very hard not to romanticize a work of art. It's very hard to pull out anything that would be sympathetic. Even lighting, even the golden light adds to a sort of a grandeur of the image. You know, the colors they're wearing, the three primaries, blue, red, yellow. Millet is someone who actually combines characteristics of classicism, romanticism, and realism all in this one painting. You know, the romantic element is the colors, the light in particular, this golden light, and it's very classically artificially constructed. He's repeating these shapes. You get these groups of three, which repeat. Three people, the haystacks here, the buildings here, too short, one tall, too short, one tall, too tall, one short. I mean, this is very intentional and very conscious. It's a way of constructing a scene. So he actually combines everything. Yes, it's working class, and there are certainly people who were very perturbed by it, but they were not as perturbed as they would have been simply because of his ability to romanticize the scene. It really is a beautiful painting. Now, let's talk about this second generation. By the mid to late 60s and 70s, realism starts to shift for many artists, and especially after reading Baudelaire, who's writing actually right at this time, this idea of, you know, observing the world. You know, one of the great observers of the world is Edouard Manet. Manet is one of my personal favorite artists, and he's such an interesting person, and I would really love to have time to really talk about him. But his work is very sophisticated, and he references many traditions in art, and this is referencing many things from earlier periods, some of which we'll talk about. Manet is commenting here on another social issue that's being discussed a lot in the courts, and that is prostitution. Prostitution was legal in France. There were over 25,000 registered prostitutes who had to be registered, and probably just as many who weren't registered. And it was becoming a scandal. It was very, very scandalous. Manet is one of the first to talk about it, and we'll see that in another work and talk about that more. But he's representing here what's considered to be a very high class prostitute, a sort of a kept woman. You know, this would be the mistress of a political official or someone important. In France, this is perfectly reputable. And this is where I usually reference the movie Gigi, or the story, if you've read the book. She is being trained to be this sort of high-class courtesan, and it's highly respected position in France at this time. He calls it Olympia. Olympia was a common name adopted by women in this position, but he's also referencing her role through this flower in her hair. This is a chameleon, and this term was often used for a type of prostitute. A chameleon was a type of prostitute, a very upper class or high level prostitute. You notice the black cat on the bed. I'd mentioned before I'd show you a cat. This is not your domestic dog, this is your cat, which identifies a little more about what's going on here. I had to tell you this. I had a student once who asked me a question about this in class and asked about, she says, but what is her slave holding? And I was dumbfounded for a second that my student assumed there was a Black person in the picture, that she was a slave. That's how much they know about history or anything else. And I had to stop and explain to her that all Black people aren't slaves, that this is a servant, not a slave. Maybe because we were in Kentucky at the time, but it struck me, and I will always remember that when I see this picture, that you have to be so careful when you talk to students or young people because of what they know and what they don't know. And you can be putting weird ideas in people's heads and not even know you're doing it. But this is her servant, not her slave at this point in time. Now, I've heard teachers a million times in my education talking about this woman and how she's so brazenly looking you in the eye, etc. And I just accepted what they said until I saw the painting in person. And I guarantee you she is neither brazen nor is she looking you in the eye. If you look, you can see, I think pretty clearly, she's looking off. She's not looking you in the eye. She's looking slightly off at a different angle. And she is very pensive and thoughtful. There's something going on in her mind. I see a very stiff body. I see a body that's not relaxed and comfortable. Her arm is covering herself. I do not see a woman who's happy and brazen in what she's doing. I see a woman who's uncomfortable. Maybe this is me reading into this painting, but I know Manet's work, and I'm going to show you another one by him that, to me, clearly validates my interpretation of this painting, because he often comments on society's role in forcing women into this position. And of course, the painting itself, interestingly, is from 1863. And it was submitted to the Salon of 1863. I have to tell you about this year. There's so much art being made that they had huge warehouses of paintings, all sitting on the floor, lined up one behind the other. You couldn't even look at it. There was something like over 5,000 paintings submitted to the Salon of 1863. So you know they didn't even look at most of them. They just went through and picked out the paintings of the people whose names they knew. But there was such an outpouring of sort of anger about the number of paintings rejected that the Academy was forced to hold an alternate salon that year. It was called the Salon des Refusés, or the Salon of the Refused, or the Rejected, and it was held in the same building, and it was in the Louvre, but down the hall from the official salon, and this painting was in the Salon des Refusés. And I find it so interesting because Manet's painting was, attacked by critics. It was seen as obscene and vulgar and, unacceptable. And yet right down the hall was Bouguereau's painting in the same salon, and it was heralded as, the most beautiful painting. So, we have to ask ourselves, what's the difference between these two? Why is one vulgar and the other completely acceptable? In fact, there were so many of these that this was called the Salon of the Venuses. There were so many paintings like this in the salon that it was officially the Salon of the Venuses. So clearly, the difference is reality. Clearly, the difference is, Bouguereau has taken this to, has taken this to, a completely different context. He's removed it from reality. And Manet is not, he's grounded it in the real world. It's realism that bothers them, not the nude in any way. But So, but my favorite of Manet's, and the one I really want to talk about, the one that's clearer and that he tells us, we know what he's doing here, is this, a bar de folie bergère. And this is a good example of Manet as the flaneur. Now, the flaneur is defined by Baudelaire is a kind of man of the world who walks through this new city with its wide boulevards and so many things to look at, and observes all these funny little human quirks, these sort of social cues that most people miss. But if you're really observing it, you see what's going on, and you can see the changes, the social changes in society. And this very much deals with the issue of prostitution again, as several of his other works do. First of all, there's one person in this picture, and this is the barmaid who's standing right in the middle. Everything behind her is seen as a mirror, is seen in a mirror. There's a mirror behind her, and everything else is just a reflection. So we see her and this bar, and then just reflections in the back. And this matters. Now, the Folie Bergère was one of many of these nightclubs like the Chat Noir and others. These were wild places. These were fairly disreputable places. This is not a place where you would ever take a wife, or a reputable woman would never step into one of these places. All the women in this bar are assumed to be prostitutes in one form or another. It's where you took your mistress for a good evening, or where you maybe went to pick up a prostitute. And in fact, Manet does a whole series of paintings that deal with what goes on in these places, like in the day and the afternoon, like working middle-class people are there certain hours of the day, and so are the prostitutes who are at their level. In the evening, the more upper level prostitutes are there. That would include like the entertainers, and certainly this barmaid. In fact, that's what's going on. Now, the reason this is scandalous is, to Manet, is not because, oh, prostitution, that's scandalous, but because there were so many women forced into this. There were more and more women in the workplace, increasingly by the 80s and 90s, and we'll see more about the 80s and 90s later, but there were very few jobs for women that paid anything, and more women as head of households, raising children that needed money, and they had no choice but to be prostitutes. They had to live, they had to eat. And this was the scandal, that women were being forced into this because they couldn't make a living wage. And in this case, what we've got is, first of all, let's look in the mirror. We've got, all the noise of this place. If you've seen any of the movies, Moulin Rouge or whatever, you have a sense of what went on there, music and wild activities. You can see in the upper left-hand corner the trapeze. They typically had trapezes and people swinging up above, everything you can think of, singers and other things. But in the midst of all of this noise, and he does suggest this noise and activity, you have this very quiet, again, introspective moment with the barmaid. And we know she's the barmaid. She's wearing what is a kind of uniform of barmaids. And she's now very clearly not looking us in the eye. She's sort of looking off to the side. And interestingly, we see her back here in the mirror. Now, the problem is he skewed this space in a way that can't be, right? Because if this is the bar here, and that's sort of the edge of a balcony, it looks like, then that mirror must be parallel to the picture plane. But if that mirror is parallel to the picture plane, her reflection can't be over here. It would be straight behind her, right? But he needs us to see this, so he's intentionally skewed it. He's also using that distortion of space as a tool, as a sort of analogy with the sort of emotion and distortion of what's going on in the scene. Because right in front of her, almost literally in her face, we see this man. But we don't see the back of the man from our view. Therefore, we must be that man. We're seeing it from his point of view. So he's actually making us, the viewer, complicit in what's happening here. And what's happening here is he's propositioning her. He's making his arrangements for, you know, when she's off duty, and she's not happy about it. This is a woman who is clearly not very happy about what she has to do, but at the same time, she has to do it. And so he often brings men into these scenes as a way of making them complicit, because right now it's like blaming the women versus blaming the men. That's what's being discussed and talked about at the time. And his method for communicating a sort of disruptive scene is contrast, this dramatic contrast between the energy of the room behind her and then this sort of still point, this kind of still moment. Just, I love this, right in the middle, and this perfect triangle. It's like Christ and you know, at the Last Supper, creating this perfect sort of balanced triangle right in the center of the composition, like the storm is waging all around, and yet she's not part of it. And that's what's so brilliant about this composition and Manet in general. The other artist who's a master flaneur of this second generation of realism is Edgar Degas. And Degas is probably better known than Manet, but he is also the flaneur, the observer. He has certain types of scenes that he goes back to over and over again, and most people are familiar with his ballet scenes. You know, he has more than 2,000 works of pastels or oils and other sorts of drawings of scenes of the ballet. It makes up more than half of his whole body of work are scenes of the ballet. And this is a good example of it. He doesn't show us the sort of performance, the sort of beauty of the performance of ballet. He always chooses backstage views, rehearsal views. He shows us the truth, the reality of the ballet, which is anything but the beautiful thing you see on stage. It has some very ugly parts to it, and he's showing us those, whether we can choose to recognize them or not. For one thing, he focuses on the corps de ballet. These are young girls. It's very different from the corps de ballet today. Typically, the corps de ballet at this time were 13, 14-year-old girls. These are girls who went on point way too early and totally destroyed their feet. There's a sort of, ballet dancers have very ugly feet anyway. You ruin your feet, your bones are all distorted, and you have serious problems with the feet the rest of your life. But it's worse if you go on point when you're very young. You can really do serious damage. The other thing you may not think about is, see these two guys back here? These are sponsors. It was very common for older men to sponsor these young girls. These young girls are in an extremely vulnerable situation. They're half clothed and were considered pretty close to prostitutes themselves. And they would have these benefactors, these older men who basically owned them. And they had the right to come and sit in and watch the rehearsals. So you see this in some of his works, sitting around the walls, there'd be chairs with these older men. So you don't think much about it, but then you realize, wait a minute, these are 13-year-old girls who are sponsored, in quotes, by these older men. We know what's going on here. And so this is not the beautiful place of the ballet stage. It's very troubling in terms of what was going on at the time. And a flaneur sees and interprets and understands that. The other thing I would point out about Degas, he is a masterful composer. He's one of my favorite designers. He can compose a space like nobody else. Here's a good example. You get this very unusual angle, pulled back in space to this corner. The floor is tilted up. I didn't bring any in to show you. So if we do more 19th century in some other class, we'll obviously go into it in more detail, but he's actually being influenced by Japanese prints. Japanese prints are coming into Europe in large numbers. And Japanese prints have very interesting points of view where the ground line is tilted up and you get these strange angles and corners, and that is feeding into some of what he's doing. So you get this very strange asymmetrical point of view with these really interesting colors and these figures who are these young girls who are sort of tired, and but they make, you know, really beautiful paintings. So this is friend Degas. I want to turn our attention to Britain. Talk about
before we leave Degas. Wait, does that qualify as romantic? I mean, it feels romantic in a way to me that it's pretty as well as disturbing.
It's his color. You're right. You're seeing his color. And some of his works, he used these beautiful pastels where it almost glows. It's the color that's doing that, absolutely. And I would say absolutely this is realism, but is with romantic elements, especially that color. Because yeah, that color is beautiful. It's a beautiful
and the light
color.
somehow is,
and the light. Yeah, he's very
glowy.
This seems more like our natural light coming in. It's a cooler light, and when he's doing like scenes like this, it's this warmer, this stage light. But he's very good with light, and that's being a realist. But at the same time, yes, I think this is romantic.
So this might be romantic in a dirty old man sort of way.
Well,
who was his
dirty old man sort of way. That's a very good way of looking at it. And then he'll often
always making there's a social commentary element. So who are his patrons that
who wants to buy this?
Well, most of the people in France wouldn't have seen it the way we see it, because we're very aware of pedophilia. They wouldn't have even considered it that. These 13-year-old girls were marriageable age.
Right.
They wouldn't have seen anything any more inappropriate than any other prostitution at the time. But remember, he doesn't have patrons. He has people who buy his work later after the fact. And they're going to buy it based on, wow, that's pretty. So he's not having a hard time selling these, not because people are even seeing the social and political. Remember, so much of this comes from hindsight, you know, our looking back and seeing the social context in a way that the people at the time wouldn't have seen social context. They would have just seen a really pretty green and a really interesting composition, and the color's incredible. So yeah, he had no problems selling his work. I mean, I
keep thinking about the U.S. gymnastic team.
Yeah, very, very similar, similar concepts.
Applying our modern brain to something that was painted back then, and then there's a little bit of a disconnect there. We can't help it. That's the way it is. But the best we can do is understand what is coming from us and understand what is coming from that moment in time. That's what we can do. We can't ignore what's going on then, because we are who we are. But at the same time, we can't just give it our interpretation and pretend like it doesn't matter what was happening then. So it's a matter of just understanding. That's all.
Absolutely.
You know, he would often, in an oil painting, he actually painted very thin. His paintings are very thin. He works very, very thin, and he works in a very linear fashion. You know, there's really no brushstrokes visible in his work. And that's why he often goes back with pastel, which is basically chalk, like a colored chalk. And he'll go back over and do things like these bright colors in chalk. I'm fairly sure these are pastel details that he adds, which makes them kind of glow in the light, which makes paintings really interesting as well.
Peggy, he put the pastel on top of the oil?
On top of the oil, yes. I've tried it, actually. I've put pastel on top of my watercolor. It's fun. Try it sometime. You can do that.
And it doesn't just brush off of the oil?
No, when it's dry. I mean, he doesn't put it on when it's wet. No, when it's dry, there's oil. Pastels isn't just powder. There are resins in there that bind it to a surface, that bind it to paper or whatever, and it will bind to this and be quite brilliant. The color will be. Try it sometime. It's really fun. It will pop your colors in really interesting ways.
So this luminescence or glow lasts through time. Doesn't have.
Absolutely, it will if they're handled properly. If they're, you know, not exposed to bright lights and like, you know, like anything else, it has to be handled properly. But yeah, some of his works are incredibly luminous, but then they've been taken care of from the beginning.
Mm. Mm.
Okay, then we get the British, which, you know, that's a whole other story. The British and the French, you know, night and day difference. You know, there's already been a long tradition in Britain for narrative art, and particularly kind of commentary. You know, I'll remind you that in just a minute, but British art is going to be different from French because number one, it's always going to have a strong illustrational element to it. Illustrational, anecdotal, these are two words used for British art. And what I mean by illustrational, illustrational art is art that comes from another source that the painter is just illustrating. And in England, that generally means literature, like illustrations from Shakespeare or illustrations from Wordsworth poems or whatever. Now, the great art form of Britain is literature. It's not painting. It never was. This is not their mainstay. It's not what they consider the highest art form, nor have they, except for, you know, certain artists periodically excelled at it. There's no question that literature is their art form. And the tie between the visual arts and the literary arts is very, very strong. It always has been. There were whole galleries in London dedicated just to art from scenes of Shakespeare. I mean, there's the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery was very famous, and it was nothing but paintings of scenes from Shakespeare. So there's always an illustrational component that in fact, this isn't where the story begins. This is just illustrating something that exists either already in print or some story that's been repeated over and over again. That's usually what anecdotal means. It's like, we all know this story, so I'm just going to make a picture of this story that's been passed down for generations. One of the most popular anecdotal stories in British literature is the governess. And this appears, you know, all over British literature in the 19th century because there were literally thousands of governesses in Britain. And some artists like Richard Redgrave did a few examples of it. You don't see it as much in painting as you do in literature, but that's its source. I mean, this is rooted maybe not in one, you know, this isn't from Jane Eyre, but it's rooted from all those stories of governesses. And this is what the British referred to as a conversation piece. And a conversation piece is a work of art that was meant to begin a conversation, that was meant to be something that you talked about. As we saw earlier in another British work, there are lots of little clues around that are meant to give you something to talk about. And governesses were often talked about because these were very vulnerable young women. These were women generally of middle class or upper middle class. These are young women who were highly educated, but because of a tragedy in their family, it's usually the death of the father. You almost always see them wearing black because they're in mourning. They don't have an older brother to take care of them. They have to go out and earn money. And being a governess was one of the few, you know, reputable jobs that a young woman could have. The problem is she was vulnerable. She's away from anyone who would protect her. And sometimes they're good situations and sometimes they're not good situations, depending on, you know, the man of the house and how he feels about the governess. But even when it's a good situation, she's alone. And they're generally shown reading letters, suggesting, you know, this is a letter from home and she's remembering it, or juxtaposed to something happy that's going on. I mean, here are some young women who may not be that much younger than she is, but they're, you know, outside in the world, they're in the bright light and they're enjoying themselves, and she's indoors. You know, this idea of the window and the outdoor world and the indoor world is something that we're going to see again in art. So he was very good at giving us this sort of subtle idea. He's not giving you an answer to anything. He's giving you something to talk about. and raising that. And they really are wonderful conversation pieces. This is another one by Redgrave. It's not the governess, it's the outcast. Again, it's the timeless story. Everyone knows what's going on here, just as everyone knew what was going on with the previous painting. Clearly, the young girl has her baby and she's being thrown out. And again, another kind of scandal that was in Britain at the time. So he's giving you things to talk about. The girl is somewhat sympathetic in that she loves her baby and she doesn't seem to be like a horrible person, but this black night that she's being driven out to, these are the streets, this is the world she has waiting for her, and how it's tearing the family apart. And the father's got his idea, but others in the family don't want her to go. So again, let's discuss this. That's what it's all about. Let's have a conversation about society. So the British were much more about, having this discussion rather than necessarily showing you the way Manet and Degas did, sort of pretty clearly what was happening in their world. Now, it makes an interesting comparison to Hogarth's. Now, the British have been doing, going back to the Enlightenment, they're showing you aspects of their society that they're questioning and challenging and having you talk about it. But there are differences here. Hogarth being an Enlightenment man, the point of view of Hogarth is absolutely clear. There's really not much to discuss. You know who he's showing as the fools. You know what he's saying about it. Where the later one, like 100 years later, he's not saying this is necessarily the right way or the wrong way. He's saying, discuss this. So it's a very different sensibility. And yet that tradition is an old one in Britain of throwing those ideas out there to deal with. One of my favorites from this, a very good example, a very well-known, successful artist, is Emily Osborne, who was very much part of this sort of circle, this sort of more liberal circle in Britain by mid-century that were talking about things like women's rights and the place of women. And this is early to be talking about it. But again, we have another young woman who's forced to go out and make a living. And Nameless and Friendless, interesting title. Now, it's easy to misunderstand this. Emily Osborne tells us what this is about, so we don't have to interpret it, because it would be easy to misinterpret. This is a young woman artist who has lost her father. She's got good works, but she needs to go out and sell them. She's obviously uncomfortable, and the other people in that picture dealer shop are not helping anything either. We'll talk about them in a minute. This is her younger brother who is accompanying her. It is important that she have a male accompanying her, even if it's just a little boy, if she wants to be a reputable person. If she goes out to sell her paintings alone, again, she will be tantamount to a prostitute. The idea is, if a woman is selling one thing, she'll sell anything, was sort of the attitude. And that's certainly how these men on the left are looking at her. It's hard to see, but they're actually looking at Degas prints of young girls partially clothed in ballet costumes. Those were considered risque images at the time. Well, no, they weren't. They aren't Degas prints, but they are ballet dancers. They're prints of ballet dancers, and because I don't know that there were prints of Degas, but these are ballet dancers. So they're looking at semi-erotic, in their minds anyway, semi-erotic images, and then they're sort of looking up and leering at her, and there's no question what they're thinking. Over here, the picture dealer is sort of thinking about it, and the guy up above is sort of looking down. He's also juxtaposing sort of again, we get the door or window juxtaposing the outdoor world and the indoor world. And the city is the world of men. You see that all the time out the windows. The city is the world of men. And she's, deeply out of place in the city. You see her discomfort. So as a woman artist, she's making quite intentionally, a very important statement. Now, interestingly, when the Royal Academy in London was founded in the 17th century, just as when the French Academy was founded in the 17th century, both of them had women admitted to the original membership of those academies. But in both places, when those women died, they were not replaced by women. There had not been any, and there's still, at this time, there are no women admitted to the Royal Academy. It was just those very first women that were members. Angelica Kaufmann, way back last time, neoclassicism, she was one of the early members, but not at this time. What they had instead were women's schools. There was an academy, let's see, what was it called? There was called an Academy of Art for Women, and France had them too, where women could go to study art. So there were places, but the problem is, of course, separate does not make them equal, and they were still looked down on. Women still wanted to be in the official academy, the formal academy. And Emily Osborne's a really good example of someone who's sort of making important statements about that. Okay, I want to talk to you now. Why on earth do I have these two things up here? This makes no sense whatsoever, right? Well, it does, because we're about to look at the pre-Raphaelites in London. And I have to show you what they meant by pre-Raphaelites. Why did they call themselves pre-Raphael? Well, Raphael in the 19th century, at the time we're talking about, was the golden boy of the Royal Academy in London. They worshipped Raphael. They worshipped him. You were supposed to paint like Raphael. What these young artists preferred was a 15th century style, more like what we saw in Van Eyck, that was rooted in not only a linear surface, but more importantly, detail. What Raphael is about, and the high Renaissance artist, is simplification, removing all those little details and symbols. But the pre-Raphaelites are going to love all those little details. And that's why they call themselves pre-Raphaelites. We want to go back to, yeah, the Renaissance is okay, but we want the 15th century Renaissance. There is, in fact, and here's the detail I'm talking about. If you remember Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, we looked at these details. Boy, they love it. And that's what is connected to realism in the pre-Raphaelites, but it's not quite that simple. There is a program, a series, it's running on Prime, Amazon Prime right now, and I don't know how many parts it is. I just watched the first episode. I can't wait to watch more. It's called The Desperate Romantics. And it's the story of the pre-Raphaelites. And the first episode was really good. The first episode was really accurate. So I'm looking forward to getting back and watching it. But I like that they call them romantics, because you cannot label the pre-Raphaelites. I am no less right than they are calling them romantics. They are classical romantics, if that makes any sense whatsoever. And we'll see how they embrace all of those ideas. One in form and the other in subject. But the pre-Raphaelites were a fascinating group of guys, and you'll get them if you watch that show, episode 1. You'll get who they are, because they're really just a bunch of big boys enjoying making trouble. They got together at the school of the Royal Academy. They were 19 and 20 when they came together. So often we think of these artists in our mind as sort of old men. This is another case where artists, the leading moment, when they're really defining their style, they're like teenagers. There's a group that in France of landscape painters that we're not looking at in this class. We just don't have time. But they were like 15 and 16 years old when they were doing the work that made them famous. But these guys were pretty young, and they just loved causing trouble. When you have a society like this that's very staid and gets upset if you do things wrong or differently, it's really fun to just go around and intentionally upset people. And that's what they like to do. They created the name Pre-Raphaelite to confuse people. They signed their paintings PRB. They didn't even put their names on it. They just signed it, PRB, which is a Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, because they liked the mystery of it, the mysticism of who are they. They wanted people asking, who are these guys? What are they doing? They liked the mystery number, the mystic number 7. There were really only 3 of them, but they invited 4 other people to sort of formally be members, even though they really weren't, just so there could be 7 of them, because that's a mystical number. I mean, that's sort of who they are. If you watch the first episode, you will see this painting being painted by a 19-year-old John Everett Millais. This was sort of the first work. Now, they're British, so they're going to be illustrational, and they're going to be tied to a text of some kind. In this case, it's biblical. But they're pre-Raphaelites, so they're obsessed with fine detail. So he goes out and studies a carpenter shop and puts in all the details that he can. And you might be able to guess how this was accepted. It was an outrage. The reality of it. Yes, this is what a workshop looks like, but this is Christ we're talking about, and we don't want all these little details on the floor and people walking around barefooted, and this is a little John the Baptist. I mean, they attacked that as just being ugly, the most ugly thing in the world. So it didn't have the expected trappings of a religious painting, and it was just obsessed with detail. This can't be the Virgin Mary. She's too real. She's like a young woman with red hair. They all have red hair. They didn't like that they gave everybody red hair. That can't be Jesus. That's grossly inappropriate. I mean, everything about it. He threw in some symbolism. There's a triangle here for the Trinity. There's a little bit of, there's a dove sitting here for the Holy Spirit, but you don't really necessarily recognize it as such. So it was a bit outrageous. But once they got the critic John Ruskin behind them, things began to change. And again, if you watch just that first episode, you'll learn about Ruskin, who's a very important person in British social criticism and art criticism. Millais actually ends up marrying Ruskin's wife, and that's another whole story. Because if you watch the first episode, you'll see why. I won't tell you why, but he was sort of burned by the Academy after the first painting. But when he did this, just a year or so later, he was embraced. The British really consider this one of their finest paintings ever. And all he did was change subject. He took it out of the religious realm and took it into Shakespeare. You can't go wrong with Shakespeare in Britain. If you want to be successful, just pick a scene from Shakespeare. But it really is a beautiful painting, but it's a classic pre-Raphaelite painting. It's clearly romantic in subject. Shakespeare's romantic. Everything about Shakespeare's romantic, but it's realist in detail. He got every little detail of every little plant exactly accurate, exactly right, and that's what they loved. It's a stunning painting, and really, I think, to me, the archetypal pre-Raphaelite painting, more so than anything else. Every perceivable detail is what he wanted to get. Millais becomes quite mainstream. In fact, most British artists are able to work through the Royal Academy in London. The Royal Academy in London is not as hostile to change as the French Academy. In fact, there's no other academy in the West that's as hostile as the French Academy, which is why they made themselves irrelevant. And the Royal Academy in London is still quite relevant because people who are sort of attacked at the beginning will eventually work their way in. In fact, Millais later became the president of the Royal Academy in London. Eventually, he was quite mainstreamed in his work. The person that really never was mainstreamed was Rossetti, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Usually the one that most people associate with the pre-Raphaelites. This is his, Rossetti is another whole story. We could do hours on Rossetti. He is of Italian descent, which is where the name comes from, but he's really British. But he's this sort of tragic figure. I mean, he does these images of women that are his models, usually his lovers at the time, but it's always tragic. You know, Rossetti never saw a love affair that didn't end tragically. I mean, that's just what they are to him. There's a sort of desperation in the man that seems to have colored his life. He does a lot of paintings that reference Dante, and that should tell you something right there, because Dante's a pretty tragic romantic figure too. I mean, his love affair and his writing about his love and unrequited love and the tragedies that, you know, he identified with Dante, I think, to a great extent. And this comes from a story from Dante, in which the woman La Pia de Ptolemy, in the story, in Dante, she was married and her husband was mean and he kept her locked up all the time and wouldn't let her loose and eventually killed her. But he's using here, this model is Jane Burden, otherwise known as Jane Morris. Do you know who William Morris is, the designer? We don't really have time to look at his work either. I would love to, but we don't have time. But she was married to William Morris, a designer, and then eventually left him and became part of, you know, his Rossetti's latest model and lover. His previous lover, who's in the first episode of the film, Lizzie, she died of laudanum poisoning. They were all taking laudanum. I think Rossetti might have died from it as well. I'm not really sure, but they're just sort of tragedy. So he's presenting her as this woman. It's like he's creating this story that he wants to believe, but isn't true, that somehow her husband, William Morris, is holding her captive and he's going to come in and save her. I mean, that's kind of the romantic world his mind lived in. And so he saw himself that way. So he's painting this tragedy, but in this detail. You know, many of you know, we see the pre-Raphaelite woman is always this woman with this long hair, red hair down and flowing. You see that mostly in Rossetti, but it's always, they all use the same models, and there were always these women. They were strong women with these strong jaws, and they looked very strong, and they had this long, thick red hair. That's what they were attracted to. It's important also to understand that in the 19th century, especially in Britain, women just didn't wear long hair down like this. This was something intimate. You only did this, you know, when you went to bed or with your husband. It was inappropriate. It was just too intimate. It was like taking off your clothes. It's where the saying, you know, let your hair down, relax. It's where it comes from. But respectable women being seen by anybody, you had your hair up. So there was something sort of erotic about long hair itself hanging down. So there's an element of that in his works. But they are beautiful. This is very much about, it's very British. You would never see this in a French painting. It's very much about pattern. It reminds me of almost like a tapestry. There's a sort of tapestry quality to it. These beautiful patterns overlaying his work. This is another thing we associate with the pre-Raphaelites. Very short-lived movement, like 5 years, and then they all went off on their own. But they had a lot of influence in art. Okay, so that's sort of different forms that realism took per se. So the first part there is just sort of reviewing. As we move into the Third Republic, okay, the Second Empire, 51 to 70. That's when Napoleon III is captured during the Franco-Prussian War, and France gets its first real republic. And there was a kind of relaxation there. You know, everybody just sort of took a breath. There'd been a century of revolts and, you know, fighting in the streets and all of that. And the Third Republic, finally they have a republic and they're able to vote. And it's a a relaxing period and a lot of freedom in the arts, and it's much less politically motivated. So we're moving now to another generation that is inspired by realism, but we don't call it realism. We call it impressionism, but it comes out of the same tradition. The first gen was political, second gen, social observation. Now this third gen is material observation. Yes, they're observing their world, so they are coming out of that realist tradition, but they're not interested in the politics and they're not interested in society. They're interested in materiality, the physical properties of that world. What do I see? How do we define impressionism? First of all, the focus is shifted now to visual perception. What do I see? How do I see it? As artists, we define them through their working methods. They work plein air. They're the first artists to truly work plein air, which means outside, outdoors. Artists have, going back to the romantic landscape painters, they went outside and painted, but they were just doing studies. They went back to their studio and under artificial light, they did the actual finished painting. But these are artists who make the whole thing, beginning to end, outside. And that's going to mean the work itself is going to be very different. They're going to have to work rapidly. If you've ever tried working outside, things are changing. The earth is turning, the sun is moving, however you want to look at it. Shading is changing, light is changing, wind is blowing. It's very hard to work outside and you have to work quickly. And that's going to add to their methodology. They're going to work quickly, quick marks. One reason they're able to do that is this is the first generation that had access to professionally made tube paints. Now, 20 years earlier, you could buy tubes. You still can. You can buy flat, empty tubes, and you can make your own paint, and you can stuff it into the tube and go outside to paint if you want to. But not a lot of people did that. It's a pain. It's easier just to work in your studio where you can have your paint that you still make prepared. But these artists don't have to make paint. They can go to the art supply store and buy tubes like we can today. And the paint they had is of a different nature. It's actually, it's a matter surface. It's a different consistency. It's really a different kind of physical paint than artists had before that. It also makes them more portable. Everything they have is more portable. You just grab your tubes and go and, close the tube up again. Now, so that's sort of their working method. But what they paint is also different. And they're being very influenced again by all this discussion of modernity. What does it mean to be modern? Baudelaire, more than anything, defines the modern world in terms of change. He says, we experience the world in a way that no generation has before us because the world is changing around us faster than it has ever changed before. And he's not wrong. That becomes the primary characteristic. Industrial revolution has added to that sense of change. It's becoming faster and faster. It's the first real world, the 19th century is the first era that's really been aware of change. It's not that change didn't happen in the Renaissance. It's just that no person in their lifetime ever saw that much change. They saw a little bit, but they never saw the change like the 19th century saw. This generation witnessed the whole city being rebuilt. It witnessed, 3 revolutions thus far. Actually, that's all there were, but they historically, most of them experienced at least one of those, if not more. The world is changing dramatically. Industrialism is causing the city to change. People are moving. They're no longer living in the same area where they worked. You have mass transit is born because people have to travel to factories. It's a whole different world. And increasingly that idea is deeply rooted in the modern sensibility. And it's something that people even through the 20th century see as a core concept of modernity. So we're going to see that even throughout the 20th century as an idea. The other thing that helps define the avant-garde is avant-gardes are now defining themselves in terms of a dialectic process. And I didn't put the term down there. If you're really interested in looking up, dialectic, just like it sounds, comes from the philosophy of Hegel, a German philosopher in the 18th century. And you've heard of his ideas, even if you don't connect them to those terms. Hegel said that change happens through a process called the dialectic, in which you have first you have a thesis or an idea, which gives rise to its opposite or antithesis. And those two things, thesis and antithesis, battle together, and out of them comes a third thing, a new thing, which is the synthesis. And that becomes the new thesis. It's a way of thinking about change. It's a model. It's a model of change that's rooted in the idea of conflict, that two things have to butt heads and conflict, and then out of that comes a new idea, which gives rise to its opposite, and they conflict, and then a new idea. So it's a way of looking at change as something that comes from conflict, which is rooted into the concept of an avant-garde, as we will see as we get into, even within the next 20 years here, conflict is going to drive the avant-garde, where one new idea battles an old idea, and out of that comes some new concept, which it then battles. And by the 20th century, that's just accepted. So that's actually the new model of modernity, is the dialectic. And it's embraced throughout 20th century culture, as we'll see over and over again. So let's look at these guys we call the Impressionists. There are a few people.
Before you go on to the Impressionists, you said there were three main pre-Raphaelites.
Yeah.
You had Millet and Rossetti. Who was the third?
Hunt, H-U-N-T. Yeah, he's got his own strangeness. Yeah, highly recommend if you have Amazon Prime. Just watch the first episode. You'll get introduced to all the guys. You'll see them paint some of these same paintings. You'll get to meet John Ruskin. So you'll get an awful lot just from the very first episode. But William Holman Hunt is his name, and he becomes kind of very religious and he was Catholic and does some really strange paintings. I don't think he's as important to the movement as Millet and Rossetti. They were the two that really defined the movement. Sorry, I should have mentioned Hunt. Okay, Impressionism. Of the people who moved through that circle in and out, there's really only one artist that fully embraced the ideals of Impressionism, and that was Claude Monet. I mean, he's really the founder, the inventor, and the only one who really maintained its values, but even he moves out of that. Most of the other artists, only in the 70s, they embrace it briefly, but then they reject it and move on. So it's the avant-garde of the 1870s. You know, they were in the 70s, they were the bad boys, they were the cutting edge. And so you see how much faster art is even changing. You know, we used to go 100 years before there was a new kind of art. Then we went 50 years. Then we went 20 years. Now we're going 10 years, and it's out of date. And we get into the 20th century, there are movements that last for 4 or 5 years. They're very important during that period, but they're replaced like that. So that's the sort of speeding up that happens with the avant-garde. Okay, this is actually early, 1869. This is like one of the very first works that fully embraces this attempt to really depict what the eye sees. Now, the Impressionists are not scientists. They're not reading color theory. They're simply looking for the first time. Many people see them as really the first artists to truly look at something and not paint what you think is there or what you think you see, but to really look. And I would agree with that. I mean, they're really looking. And when you really look, you might be surprised at what you really see, or more importantly, what you really don't see. The argument being, when you think of like Renaissance paintings, I think of like Raphael's School of Athens, where you have this huge painting and all these people and this central vanishing point in the middle, and you see everyone in perfect clarity. And the argument might be that they would have made was, well, maybe in the Renaissance, people had the time to look at their world that way and focus on every little detail. So maybe that was an okay way of depicting their world, but we're modern and we don't interact with our world that way. We're busy people. We move through it fast, and I may, turn my head and glimpse something and look away and move on. And that's how I take in reality. And that's what I want to find a visual way of expressing. How do I express that sort of fleeting sense of reality? So that's what this is meant to suggest. It really looks like that. It looks like I just went over and took a glance. I didn't see the detail. I didn't see who the people were or what they were really doing. I just got an impression of what this place looked like. Now, they didn't choose the name. The name was given to them. It was a derogatory term given to them by a critic when they showed, when he saw some of their work, but it stuck and they were just fine with it. What they're seeing that other people didn't see, because of course they're working outside, is the fact that shadows are blue, reflections are blue. Most painters before this, they were taught that painting should be predominantly warm, especially if you're outside. It should be predominantly rosy and warm colors. But the reality of it is, because of the nature of our eyes, and they didn't quite understand why, but when you're outside under our sun, which is a yellow orange spectrum, because of this thing called retinal fatigue, which fatigues certain color receptors, what you see in shadows is actually the complement of the yellow orange, which is the blue violet, which is why snow looks blue in the sunlight, very blue in the sunlight. A lot of people to paint snow white, but if they truly looked at it and stopped filtering what they know and just look, they would see that it's bright blue. You capture it in photographs. If you're photographing outside in the sun, you'll get a print. It'll just be this bright blue snow, and it's like, where did that come from? Well, you were really seeing it. You just didn't realize you were seeing it. So they were criticized because of the cool colors. Actually, one critic suggested they all suffered from an eye disease, which he called indigomania, which I love. Because they were medicalizing everything in the 19th century anyway. Every social act was given a medical cause. So this was indigomania, but you really do see it that way. This is actually a very popular place. It's a sort of floating restaurant. Le Grand Rouillet is the name of it. Which means the frog pond, which was the name of this place, where you could swim. There's some people over there in the water. You could have drinks and have dinner. It's just a popular place. It's an ordinary place. So there's a genre element to this. We don't even call it genre anymore. It's so normal for realists just to depict your world. But that's what he's showing us here, done very quickly. It's really quite thick paint. Here's a detail where you can see a little better how he's doing it. And it's really quite amazing, the illusion that he's created with these very abstract and quick marks of the brush. When you look at the whole thing, that really looks like water. It's quite amazing. And I spent a lot of time trying to do water, and a million people have different suggestions for how to do it. This is the simplest way, but I guarantee you that's not easy. I've tried doing water a million times, and getting it right is very, very hard to do. By the mid-70s, this is sort of his mature work, Gladioli. It's sort of dissolving the scene completely. Impressionism is going to be very much criticized by the generation of the 80s. And we'll come back to why this is criticized when we get to that point. But I can tell you right now, it's because everything is sort of dissolving. There's no form here. There's no structure here. And for the French, eventually their classical bias is going to come back, and they're going to want some kind of structure and form, which he's not giving us. Now, by the 80s, and this is 83, everybody else has left Impressionism, and frankly, so has Monet. I'm calling this Impressionism, but it's being very strongly influenced by something else that's happening at this time. by a movement called the Symbolist movement, which is much more romantic in nature. And Monet is very much caught up in that. A lot of his works through the 80s and the 90s have that sensibility. It's absolutely beautiful. And this is a beautiful reproduction. You don't always get great digital images, but this is great. You can see the texture. It's a really high quality image, but you can see the sort of light as it reflects off the water and bounces up here. So you get that warm light of the sun, you know, playing against the cool of the blues and greens. It's a beautiful painting. It's one of my favorite Monet paintings. I like his later work much more so than his earlier pure impressionist art. But in the 80s, he starts doing serial paintings, and
those are like my favorite paintings in the world.
So they're quite beautiful because
series.
They're also they have very much that symbolist sensibility to them. He's very caught up in that. But I thought I'd show the Rouen Cathedral series because that really points out, you know, what is still his goal. He's, I think, unconsciously absorbing symbolist ideals, but he's not embracing. To symbolists, you paint a cathedral, there's a religious implication there. It's about spirituality, it's about all those things. But to Monet, it is still a surface. You know, he hasn't left that. It's a surface that's filled with what we call surface incident and ornament. You know, there's a lot of shadows and the light moves across it in interesting ways. That's why he chose it. And also he rented this storefront. There was an empty storefront right across the street and down at an angle. He could sit in the storefront with, you know, glass, and he could work year round. He was protected, but still look out across the street and see the cathedral. So there's a whole series of these. The point is, he's intentionally choosing different times of day, different seasons of the year, because the light, this is all about atmosphere and light and how it reflects off surfaces. So his original goals are still the same, but he has embraced a symbolist sensibility in colors, and therefore they can't help but be slightly more romantic because of that. You know, he chooses neutral subjects like the haystack series. It's a bunch of haystacks, for heaven's sake. You know, those can't mean anything. He chooses it because it's nothing but an object that light reflects. And even this, to him, didn't mean anything more than that. And then, you know, when he moves to Giverny, when he gets his home in the north and begins working on his gardens, I love his early work from Giverny, which this is absolutely, I think, stunning as a painting. You know, he's at home now. This is where he lives. This is his yard. He just lives out there and paints it. He lived to be, you know, well into his 80s. I think he was 86 or something, and worked out there till he lives till 1926. So he's having an effect and is affected by what's going on in early 20th century art, which is really, as we will see, very different from this, but he's still a voice out there, and he's absorbing their voices. But I love these marks. What you're seeing in his later work is very different. His earlier Impressionist works, he was fairly haphazard with his mark making. You know, you just make marks. But these are very structured. You get these wonderful verticals. You know, he's defining the form more by the mark making. And that's not something he did before. That's actually something that is more from the symbolists. And you see it here as he's shaping forms. And it's more like the post-impressionists, as we're going to see in just a little bit as well. And of course, everybody's familiar with the very big paintings, the very late ones. These are massive canvases. He would work outside and he would have these pits dug into the ground and these pulley systems so that the painting could be lowered down so he could, you know, reach it. And we've learned, you know, since then that many of them like continue on. They're like a panorama. You could line up 3 or 4 of these and see the scenes. Here's a detail. So this is the, you know, I mean, this is done, you know, could be as late as the late 20s. You know, non-objective art is being made at this time. Artists all over the Western world are painting completely abstract works of art. This is nothing, you know, that out of context. If you want to ask questions, I'm going to ask to just, you know, unmute yourself and say something, and then you'll pop up on my screen. and I'll be able to see you. It's really hard for me while I'm talking and watching 5 different things to read comments that are being, I really, that's one more thing that I'm able to do. So just jump in and ask a question, please.
I just wanted to say, when we had those panels lined up when Monet exhibit came to Kansas City, and it was just.
I saw them here.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I saw them here. It was the only place I've ever seen them, but I absolutely remember because one of them was one of the paintings that's permanently here, wasn't it? I could be wrong about that, but I thought that was right not long after the time where they had discovered, they didn't know for a long time that they connected up. But I absolutely remember when they had them here and lined them. That's great. It's fun to see them that way because it really is a panorama and it like encircles you. That's how they show them. That they're in the Orangerie in Paris, and they have a whole like oval room that's completely surrounded with these, and you just step in it and you're in the middle of all of the paintings. Good one.
Maybe St. Louis owns one of those instead of Kansas City.
Does it?
I hope somebody with a better memory than me remembers where those came from, but I think you see one in St. Louis Museum of Art for years.
It may very well be. I've been there many times, but I can't remember. It's terrible.
I'm always smitten by it, so
yeah, they're really beautiful. The sort of second impressionist that we remember or think about most is Renoir, and Renoir went through that circle of Monet briefly in the 70s, but then he rejects Impressionism and moves in a very different direction. But it's interesting to look at a different painter painting the same scene. This is his version of Le Grand Rouillé. And quite literally, the two men were standing next to one another when they painted these. So that makes it even more interesting that two people side by side looking at the same thing paint very different things. Renoir is much more interested in the people, and you can see that clearly. And he is through his whole career. He goes on to be, one of the major portrait painters of his generation, and he focuses on people. So even in these, he focuses more on people. You see, he's given us a closer in view. As well. So again, because he's focusing on the people, during the time they were painting, people are coming and going. So they've chosen different moments. So we have different boats, but it's also Renoir's color. Renoir has much more of a romantic sensibility to him personally. And his colors are always more romantic. And so Monet is really sort of very staid and very matter of fact, where Renoir is much more romantic, primarily through his colors and his emphasis on the people. And there are some other Renoirs I want to look at that are not Impressionism. This is not Impressionism. See, one of the things I always have to tell people, and I'll tell you as well, from this point on, don't ever categorize an artist. You can categorize a work of art, you can label a work of art, but not an artist, because that's too limiting at this point in time. Most artists go through many different phases, work in many different ways. So if you label Renoir an Impressionist, then you'll never understand most of the work he makes, because most of the work he makes is not Impressionist at all. So we can't call it Impressionism unless it meets the characteristics, and this most definitely is not Impressionism. This is Renoir as a realist, just like Manet and Degas. This is Renoir as the flaneur, observing the world. He may use a loose painterly style that he learned from when he was an Impressionist, but this is not an Impressionist painting. It's a beautiful painting. It's one of my favorites of his. I think it's really beautiful, but it's very much, it has a social context. This is the flaneur's eye, a topic that was very popular at this time. It's called the loge, which is of course like a balcony in the theater, and you have a young woman with her escort there. Now she's in a balcony, so right in front of her, it drops down. There's nothing in front of her. So we seem to be a few feet in front of her. So where are we? Hovering in space? Well, no. The logical answer to that is we're way across in another balcony, but we're looking at her through our binoculars in the same way that that man is looking at some other woman, because this is why you went to the theater or the opera. It had very little to do with what was going on stage, which is why the box seats are facing one another as opposed to facing the stage. If you want to see the play, you sit down on the floor because you're facing the stage. But if you want to see and be seen, which is mostly what this was about, this is how you did it. And we see these characters sort of all playing their role. She knows very well she's being watched. She's taken her opera glasses and set them down. She's kind of looking at us. She knows, she sees this person. And it's always assumed to be a male. If you haven't recognized that yet, absolutely, all viewers of works of art are assumed to be male. That's cool. How are you doing that?
Peggy?
Is that a mirror?
Peggy?
Yes.
I just want to show this painting that a friend of mine did.
Really? That is so cool.
I mean, it's oil. I mean, yeah, and she never, ever had an art class in her life.
Wow. I mean, I can't see it well, but it looks really accurate.
I know. I think it's about the same size, too.
I could not figure, I saw that there and I couldn't figure out what I was looking at. I thought, are you holding up a mirror or something? And I thought, no, that can't be a mirror of your computer screen.
Like she said, it's a friend. We're not art thieves, okay?
Well, that's good, because I would have to turn you in if that were the case. But that's really interesting. So you've got several really good reproductions of pieces or posters of pieces.
Yeah,
Excellent.
this is an original.
That's an original. That's an original. So yeah, so she is there for the purpose of being seen. And most importantly, yeah, this is about, there's a lot of dialogue going on about, actually in the 80s, in contemporary criticism in the 1980s, there was a lot of discussion about, as part of the sort of feminist analysis of art, the idea, the role of seeing and being seen within power structures. That this is a period where the power is in the viewer, the seer. The woman is to be seen, and that minimizes her power. So there's a lot of feminist literature actually from the 1980s that deals with issues like that, looking at paintings like this. But you see this sort of circular sort of activity happening. This is another Renoir where he deals with a similar subject. A little later, this is the Renoir that critics today don't care for. This is one of his favorite colors, this strange russet orangey color, and his paintings get all sort of blurry and fuzzy. And Renoir goes in and out of favor in the contemporary art world. Some people really love him, some people really hate him. But anyway, this is a painting called The First Outing, and we have the same thing going on. This is a young girl who's being brought to the theater to be displayed for the first time. This is like a coming out party, like a debutante ball. It's like, okay, she's available now, so she's on view, and she has her escort here. And you see sort of the young men who are all turning their eyes and seeing her. But that's not the interesting painting I want to show you. This is the interesting painting. This was painted just a few years later by Mary Cassatt. Now, the question is she directly commenting on this painting by Renoir? And it's very likely that she was. Mary Cassatt was sort of in this Impressionist circle. She was an American woman in Paris who showed with the Impressionists. And she does go through an Impressionist phase, but she also goes through a realist phase. This is sort of realist art. She'll go through a post-Impressionist phase. She's much more versatile like Monet or even Renoir, she was sort of on the outside. They didn't really let women in, and especially not an American woman. But this is the same theater, but this is now, she is a widow. She's in black. And in Paris at this time, widows held a special position in terms of the freedoms and expectations. The ideal position for a woman was to be a widow, because widows were granted freedoms that unmarried women and married women were not granted. Widows could go by themselves places. They could be unescorted if they wanted to. In fact, they often acted as a chaperone. They could be trusted. And it has something to do with, they were sort of desexualized. Young unmarried women and married women had sort of sexual personas that had to be protected, where widows were treated a little differently. And it's interesting because she's the only woman that's sort of taken the power. She's picking up the glasses and she's doing the looking. Now there is an older man over here, I love this, who's like looking at her, which is kind of interesting because she hasn't escaped that subject, being the subject of someone else's view. But nonetheless, it's interesting that the female artist is taking this whole subject and looking at it in a slightly different way and empowering the woman in a slightly different way. She's best known, of course, for her images of the mother and child. This is what we think of when we think of Mary Cassatt. And they're beautiful paintings. These are, I call them genre portraits if you have to categorize them. We've seen these popular for a long time. They're people, but they're not formal portraits. They're usually, images of friends or family members. So they have a sort of genre quality to them. Now, Mary Cassatt never married and never had children, which is most typical of women artists. So, but nonetheless, there was a market for paintings like these, and they aren't just by women. There are men painters who did images of mothers and children. There was a sort of market for these sort of popular subjects. But before we, there's also no question that many of her images are also connected to this other tradition. Notice how, she has the child reaching up and grasping. I mean, these are techniques that Raphael knew in terms of creating sort of relationships or suggesting relationships. So in all of these images of mother and child, there is an element of Madonna and child as part of the scene, and certainly in French culture. But I have to show you before we finish my favorite woman painter of this period, and that is Berthe Morisot. Berthe Morisot is a French woman who also sort of was part of the circle. She was a little more acceptable to the men than Mary Cassatt, because at least she was French, but she was still a bit of an outsider. Her mentor, she had a mentor in Edouard Manet, not Monet, but Manet, the realist, because he was her brother-in-law. She was married to Eugene Manet, Edouard's brother, and therefore her husband was actually very supportive of her. So she painted pretty much her whole life. She had one daughter, but she really painted most of her life and was quite supportive. She actually influenced Manet. Manet went through a sort of impressionist phase in the 70s for a while under her influence. So generally when you have like a male artist who is mentoring a younger female, the assumption is always the influence goes, from him to her. That's not always the case. The same is sort of true with Mary Cassatt. She was mentored by Degas, and they influenced each other back and forth. She was influenced a lot by his compositions, and some of her compositions are very like him, but they were both influenced by Japanese prints and other things like that. But Morisot focuses on women and the sort of social place of women. Women could visit parks, but the major parks that a lot of the male artists went to, the Bois de Boulogne and some of the bigger parks, reputable women couldn't go there because the prostitutes hung out in those parks. But there were smaller parks like this that women could visit. She developed her own style. It's a very unusual composition. It's very asymmetric. You see the figures cut off. The guy used to do that a lot, cut figures off. It creates a more dynamic, a lot of movement. It feels more natural, like you've just glimpsed the scene again. It creates a kind of immediacy, like it's something that's there and gone again, and a very agitated brushwork. But what I like are her paintings where she does images of women, and not always with children, but there's an intimacy here. She often uses, again, the mirror and the juxtaposition of the outside world of men to the inside world of women. And then she emphasizes that here even more with this sort of focus. They're sewing, they're stitching, and so they're like looking in, and so it just draws your eye to this little point. So it's very much the sort of inward world of women. There's I have to read you this little excerpt. When Berta and her sister Edna were young ladies at home, they took drawing lessons. They had a drawing teacher, which was not uncommon. All young women, they took, they were expected to know how to sort of play a piano and sing and do, draw and the like. These were considered what were called drawing room skills. They were never supposed to make you be professional, but they were to teach you a little bit so you could entertain your family and, be an entertaining hostess. And so the drawing teacher wrote a letter to their parents, and this is an excerpt. The drawing teacher said, quote, "Considering the characters of your daughters, my teaching will not endow them with minor drawing room accomplishments. They will become painters. Do you realize what this means? In the upper class milieu to which you belong, this will be revolutionary. I might almost say catastrophic. Are you sure that you will not come to curse the day when art, having gained admission to your home, now so reputable and peaceful, will become the sole arbiter of the fate of two of your children?" I mean, he was really warning them that these young girls were good and they better stop this right now because this could get out of hand. So fortunately for us, the parents' response was to find them another teacher. And they did. They found them a very good teacher named Camille Corot, who's a very famous painter, who we, again, don't have the time to really look at here. But before we finish, just one last and then we're finished. I have to show you my favorite Bertha Morisot painting. It's in the Chicago Art Institute. Woman at her toilette, doing her morning ablutions and getting ready for the day. And it's just this wonderful, sort of warm, almost monochromatic image of this figure that's all these wonderful creams, and it's very sensual. You just feel, you want to put your hands on, you desperately want to touch it because you want to feel it moving through with just these slight hints of color on the face and a little rose here and in the mirror. And in person, it's much more beautiful than this even. It's really stunning. This is why Bertha Morisot is my favorite painter. So this again is not Impressionism, even though I have the label up there, but it's an indoor scene. But nonetheless, it has some of the characteristics of that. And that actually gets us to a good point. Next time, we're ready to finish up the 19th century, and we're turning to the 80s and 90s, and all hell breaks loose. And the 80s and 90s is the foundation of the 20th century. This is where the 20th century is born, in the conflicts of this period. So next time we'll take a look at the great battle between the real and the imaginary, between artists who, realism and the realist sensibility has dominated art since mid-century. And many artists have had enough, who think that this is not what art should be. We need to be using our imaginations. We need to be doing other things. And so the great battle begins for the label of avant-garde. Notice that the Academy is gone. Nobody's even talking about it. Nobody's interested in it. Nobody's bothering to even submit to the Academy. They couldn't care less. It's unimportant. And we'll talk more next time again about the various exhibitions that are created to make the academy irrelevant during this period. So any more questions or comments or discussion or anything about the period? Yeah.
What could you just touch on a few things that pop in your mind about what was going on in other parts of Europe or the US at that time while this was going on?
There are very similar things happening. Impressionism, for example, was international. We only looked at Paris. If I were doing a 19th century course, we would have gone and looked at German Impressionism, which is quite different. We would have looked at America. In this country, there's an American Impressionist movement. None of them fully embrace exactly the French ideal, but it's happening there. Realism was happening in in Germany. The Germans embraced realism, and in fact, even German Impressionism is still more tied to the realist social commentary. They don't let that go the way the French do. And it's different in America as well. So a lot of the same things are happening in other places in Europe, because they're connected. Sometimes I'm amazed at how
you mentioned
they were. People traveling back and forth. Yes. My internet connection is unstable. It says, I can't hear. Say it again.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
You mentioned the Japanese prints several times. What did the Far East influence have on Europe and America?
Okay, I will bring some in next time and start with that. Japanese prints were coming into this country in huge numbers in a really interesting way. People have been obsessed in the 19th century. During the Rococo period, they started importing porcelain from China. By the 19th century, the Japanese figured out how to make Chinese ceramics. It's true. Japanese style and Chinese style couldn't be more different, but Europeans wanted Chinese style. So the Japanese started making Chinese style ceramics, and they started exporting them to Europe. The Japanese have been doing this for a long time. They're much better business people than the Chinese were. And what they were doing, okay, Japanese prints were really popular in the 18th and 19th century. They were prints that were made in huge editions, thousands of them, and they had stacks and stacks of these prints, which are on paper. And they started wrapping ceramics. They started using it as like scrap paper. They would take these prints and wrap ceramics in it. And so in Europe, people were unwrapping all their ceramics and seeing these incredible prints. And it was an aesthetic they'd never seen before. And so they started saying, stop wadding these up and just send us your prints. So then they started importing these Japanese prints. I will bring some in next time, and I will show you what I mean by that influence in the art. But it's a different aesthetic. It's at the end of the 19th and early in the European art in terms of their experimentations with space and form. And so you can see why Europeans were seeing an interest in it. So anyway, yeah, I'll bring some in and show you next time. We'll start with that and talk about that more.
Thank you, Peggy. A great session.
You're welcome. Anytime. Have a good week, everybody. I'll get something out to you on 20th century before next week, because I expect we'll finish 19th and get a start on 20th next week. We better. Have a good week, everybody.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.